So here we are with another episode of Coffee with the Founder. Got my drink here. Of course, we got another phenomenal guest, Christina Jimenez. I'm Eddie Moore Jr., founder of the White Privilege Conference. He, him, and his are the pronouns I go by. Christina, we're doing coffee talks as a way to introduce people in the WPC family, the network, to one another better, to learn about the work we do, not just when we're at the conference, but also the work we do when we get back to our respective places. So let's get started by asking you, who are you and what do you do?
Well, thanks, Eddie. Thanks so much for having me here with, Coffee with the Founder. And, I'll just start off by saying that I'm so grateful to you for the leadership you've taken with the WPC and generally with educating people in the US and around the world about this really important idea of privilege, white privilege, and white supremacy. So I am a historian. You know this, but for your audience members, the large WPC community out there, I'm a Latin American historian, and I also do Latino and immigration histories as a secondary field. A lot of my work at the university in the classroom, though, really centers on the region south of the US-Mexico border. So Mexico, all the countries of Central America, all of the countries of South America, and all of the kind of Latin-derived countries of the Caribbean. My particular research really focuses on politics and citizenship activism, popular activism in 19th and 20th century Mexico. So for me, white privilege is very much connected to the idea of US privilege beyond the US borders.
Okay, I got so much to ask you because I really feel like it's one area of our education that we don't get a lot of information about. And if we do get information, it's sometimes headlines like build a wall. So let's start with some basic concepts. When you say US Latin America, are you meaning they're connected? What do you mean by that? In addition to Mexican American, are those things the same? Is that synonymous? Can you talk a little bit about just those terms, US Latin America, Mexican American, US Latin American, Mexican relations? Is all that one thing?
Okay, so again, Latin America refers to really the whole region south of the US-Mexico border. And there are different ideas about where the term Latin America comes from, but we generally connect it to the colonial histories of Spain and Portugal in the Americas. So, all of current day Mexico, most of current day Central America, and much of current day South America were all colonies of Spain. The big exception to that is, of course, Brazil, colony of Portugal, and then the certain islands of the Caribbean, again, colonies of Spain, Portugal, France, Netherlands, and England. Jamaica, right, is particularly the English colony that's noteworthy. So for me, when I talk about US Latin American relations, I'm really speaking about the United States' relationship with that whole region, because the US really has treated the whole region very kind of homogeneously in many ways. Soon after the US declared its independence from Britain, it was turning around and declaring the rest of Latin America as its kind of area of control. So this is under the Monroe Doctrine in 1821. And of course, before that, right after independence, in 1803, the U.S. purchased the Louisiana Purchase from France, but that territory of the Louisiana Purchase had been largely a colony of Spain for many, many years before that. So, you know, the history of U.S. expansion westward is something that we, I think, are very familiar as U.S.ers. You know, the kind of not only the U.S.-Mexican War in 1846 to 48, but just the whole push west. But what we don't, I think, often enough articulate is how that U.S. expansion was westward, but it was also southward to extending U.S. Control and at least attempts of control through neo-colonial patterns to the rest of the region of Latin America. And there are just many, many different examples of this in any particular country that we go to. So that's really what I mean by U.S. Latin American relations, is this 19th and 20th century consistent engagement of the U.S. with that region. Now, in contrast to that, when we think about Mexican Americans, you know, those just like African Americans, those are people of Mexican descent who are U.S. citizens often, or they're U.S. residents, or they could be descendants of migrants or residents, migrants or immigrants from Mexico who became residents, or they could be, you know, here before U.S.ers were here. If their family is, you know, historical kind of Californian families, right? Or New Mexican families. So, I mean, there's just, I know there's a lot of confusion around the terms. I think I asked students to think about it as, think about nationality as distinct from your ethnicity, right? Or your racial identity. So, you know, people often say, well, everyone in Mexico are Mexicans. But, you know, Mexican is it's an ethnic identity, but it's also a national identity. You also have racial identities within Mexico, where you have indigenous groups, hundreds of different indigenous groups, and you have people who are racially white, even though they're all, you know, citizens, or many of them, right, citizens of Mexico. So anyways, it gets confusing, but that's a long answer to your question. So I'm gonna hand it back to you.
No, it's helpful to get some clarity, which yet still produces some complexities. So I was going to ask you, based on all of your work and research, if you wanted your student, what do you want your students to know about this subject matter? What is it? What's the takeaway after either a semester or a year or even 4 years? If you were advising, you know, departments focusing on these issues, what is your optimal goal for students experiencing your class or classes like yours?
Yeah, so I think that goal has probably changed a lot over the years that I've been teaching this subject. And I'm going on 20 years as a professor, and I think I'd probably distill it down to like 3 things. I think the first is just getting them to really question some of their assumptions that they make about the US's role in the world. And students often have they've been raised with an assumption that, you know, America is exceptional in the sense of being a beacon of freedom and democracy for people, not only for people in the US, but also for countries where the US is going to kind of intervene politically, diplomatically, militarily. The assumption is often that, you know, the US is there to create a context of political freedom and democracy for those other regions. And the reality does not support that, particularly in the history of Latin America, where there's a paradox, because in most Latin American countries, and of course, here I'm completely generalizing, oversimplifying, but still there is real truth here. In most countries of Latin America, the US has intervened for really two main purposes: to keep in power leaders that are going to bend to the economic and political will of the US, and two, keep leaders in power in those countries who will maintain economic policies that are to the advantage of investors, particularly foreign investors, not necessarily to the advantage of the people living in that country. And the consequence has been this deep paradox or hypocrisy, where students learn through the semester that even though the US might internally stand for freedom and democracy and, you know, economic opportunity, the policies that they pursued in these other Latin American countries deny those same opportunities to Nicaraguans, Hondurans, Mexicans, because they want to maintain a system of economic profit, a profit that will go out of the country. So, you know, I always tell my students it's reasonable to think that a country's foreign policy will work to the benefit of that country, right? So we can argue about that, but that's reasonable to me. What's kind of irrational is to assume that the policies beneficial to the US are also going to be beneficial to the people of Mexico or Ecuador or, you know, Honduras, for example, because they're not. And so that's one thing I want students to know. I think the second thing is ask them to think about the way that we think about big concepts like Western civilization. You know, Western civilization is something we often hold up as this kind of cradle of kind of democracy and rights, and we tie it to Western Rome often, and Europe and the US then is an extension of that. Well, it kind of infers that we're talking about the Western Hemisphere, and most of the Western Hemisphere is occupied by the continent of South America, as well as the Isthmus, right, with all the Central American countries, and then Mexico. And there were high-level civilizations in the form of the Mexica Empire, the Aztec Empire, the Mayas. We don't consider any of that as part of our history of Western civilization, right? And I think that is because of the way that whiteness, Europeanness, Americanness has been created as a kind of superior cultural and racial identity that connects to all of our history of colonialism and neocolonialism. And for me, Western civilization, that concept is something that perpetuates notions of white supremacy and white privilege beyond the US and Europe. It also internally reinforces these hierarchies, right? But it's certainly something that I think we unconsciously use much too much. And I think, you know, then the third thing would be just getting students to know and appreciate a little bit about the complex histories, the rich cultures, and just the peoples of Latin America.
Yeah. And I was wondering about today, you know, and what's your sense? What's your feeling? What are your thoughts about some of what we're seeing today when it comes to particularly Mexico, the Mexican border, build a wall? I mean, what, as a historian, what's your sense of that in reference
Yeah.
to where it comes from, its impact? Give me your thoughts around that.
Well, so I mean, the idea of building a wall and keeping Mexicans out is nothing new when we as a historian. I mean, this is something that we see again and again as kind of scapegoat rhetoric. And in that sense, it doesn't, surprise me. I think what does surprise me, and it's hard to surprise me around these issues now. It does surprise me that people could kind of justify keeping families who are seeking just refuge, right, from political oppression. One, keeping people in cages, and two, breaking up families, taking children away from their parents. So those are the type of practices that we have not really seen, I mean, in the 20th century in the US, in the sense. I think there are practices that are explained away by politicians or people that will justify them based on really deep-seated issues of race. So, yeah, I mean, the talk of the wall and stuff and the building of the wall, that's kind of always been around, but the idea of breaking up families and or that it's okay to keep people in cages for weeks and months it's another level of human rights violations, let alone civil rights violations, that is surprising to me.
Yeah. I'm wondering about COVID-19. I don't know if we're getting, at least from South America, any kind of frequent updates like we are from Italy, the UK, and some of the other kind of European countries. What's your sense of the pandemic, its impact, and possibly the days that will follow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so well, I mean, the US, the mainstream US news media is just, pathetically ignorant of what's happening in Latin America. And I think it keeps all of us in the US ignorant about it unless you go out to really seek, valid information. And, the journalists of Latin America are doing really amazing work. Under often a lot of kind of threatening circumstances. But so what I would say is, there's going to be lots of suffering, and there is lots of suffering, particularly for the lower economic classes of Latin American countries. There is the correlation in terms of racial identity, and the lower kind of socioeconomic stratas of most Latin American countries also correspond to those people, those communities with the highest identified indigenous communities. So this pandemic is going to hit the indigenous communities of Latin America extremely hard. They have the least access to resources, everything from information to prevention to, of course, healthcare support. What is exacerbating that is the way that certain politicians in Latin America are taking advantage of the crisis to further exert their authoritarian executive powers and they're eliminating regulations in terms of environmental protections. And Bolsonaro of Brazil is, of course, the kind of emblem boy of this approach. In Latin America, as in the US, so there was a whole shift to the left in terms of left of center politics in the election of many socialist presidents right around 2000. Our first indigenous president, Evo Morales in Bolivia, some of the first female heads of state in Chile, in Brazil. Post 2010, there was a shift backwards to the right again. And so Bolsonaro is who I would describe as Brazil's version of Donald Trump. And he is, denying, right, the impact of the epidemic, talking about it in terms of, this kind of rhetoric of conspiracy, right? And he's using it as a way to eliminate environmental protections that directly impact the indigenous communities in Brazil. So, I think what's going to happen is we're going to see an exacerbation of inequality. And, beyond that, I don't know, Eddie. It might get bad.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering also about your work with the Latinx community here stateside, there, Colorado, but also across the nation, because as you were talking, especially talking about, which really helped me, the African-American experience, not being from Africa, but having some, histories and maybe some families from, there could be some real similarities in how, those two groups can be seen in that way. And it made me wonder about the relationship between those communities, African Americans, Latin Americans. What's been your sense, especially here in the States, but also maybe even globally in reference to Latin America and Africa and other nations of color led by folks of color? Are you optimistic about some of those relationships?
Yeah. Well, let me see. I think I'm gonna talk about the connection between, for example, Mexicans who are in the U.S., Mexican Americans, and kind of their communities and families in Mexico. Or we could say the same about, people who are here and are, Guatemalan Americans, but who have, still family connections to Guatemala. So there is no question that community and those connections are incredibly strong and vibrant. So, for example, and I think this really differs from the African American experience, the connection to Africa, right? We have the proximity of just close distance, right, across the US-Mexico border. And we have the history of just continuous migration and immigration cycles between Latin America and the US that have continually, brought, or I should say, solidified that connection. There's also a financial connection. So, the remittances, the financial remittances, that's money that people in the US back to Mexico, is a substantial portion of their national income. So that's, these are foundational connections. And what is happening with the shutting of the border, what is happening with, of course, the kind of rolling back of protections in terms of DACA, is that those community ties are being strained more and more, because people can't go back and see their families, or families are being separated if, you know, older children that weren't born here need to go back to Mexico, maybe with the parent, but the younger children that were born here stay with an aunt and uncle. I mean, you're seeing again the split up of families. So yeah, the connections are there, they're vibrant, but they're being really strained. And so I'm hoping we can get to just nationally a kind of place where we can really validate and value those connections, because, you know, for the Latinx community, it's not just about the community that's here in the US, it's about maintaining those connections back to your, you know, native country, your home country, your cultural home. Yeah, it's a stressful situation.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. I think partly just asking, as I'm simultaneously learning so much just in this short amount of time, based on what I didn't know, what I didn't learn, and also just thinking about, you know, the challenges ahead as we look at particularly young people who I think are grappling with some of these issues and being informed or misinformed from not only white communities, but also communities of color that can sometimes even pit them against one another. And I mean, what's your sense? How are you feeling about the next 25 years as it relates to some of the work and research you've been doing, but more specifically as it relates to young people?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I want our young people to be prepared to engage in the really challenging conversation that they have ahead of them. I mean, not only around issues of, you know, issues of, for example, of consumption, right? That, you know, the certain small percentage of a kind of industrialized, digitized countries around the world consume such a vast percentage of the resources, right? Or when we look at the number of people around the globe living in poverty, and you know, how I think ethical questions are going to come to bear on these generations when we start thinking about, well, what does that mean when I keep wanting to buy all of this stuff made of plastic from some factory somewhere where a child is being exploited to provide me with this, you know, this good? I mean, I think the young people are already starting to question some of that. Not only the way that it links to global inequalities, but the way that it links to climate change, for example. So I hope that we can give them the tools to engage in these hard conversations, because it takes not only, you know, the ability to listen and to really hear something that you maybe have not been taught before, or maybe were taught only part of the whole equation. But I think it is also going to take a lot of self-reflection and introspection about the way that we all participate in these systems, where in some way in our brain we can justify away, oh, well, those people are really poor and they're used to living in poverty and not having enough food and water, so I don't have to worry about their suffering. You know, that's I don't think that that's going to be the space to move us forward. It's going to be the space to move us forward will be young people taking on the hard decisions of, well, maybe I don't need to do this and that. What I need to do is, you know, X, Y, and Z. And I need to talk to my friends about it and my parents about it. So that's what I'm hoping. I'm hopeful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know you got to get going, but I was going to ask you what's on the horizon the next 10 years. What do you see? Either work, research, teaching, anything you got cooking, anything you're excited about as you look at the next 10 years?
Yeah, sure. So I just published a book that I've been working on for many years on urban politics in a city in Mexico, a state capital called Morelia. It's the capital of Michoacan, a beautiful city that now, well, not so much in the last year, but for many years was dealing with the intrusion of a lot of big cartels, drug cartels in Michoacan. But my work is really highlighting the activity and the kind of proactiveness of people in the informal economy and service sectors in Mexican cities. So who is that? This is the people that survive, making enchiladas and selling them on the corner. The self-motivated entrepreneurs who figured out how to kind of work the system. That's my Mexico research I'm doing. And I'm really excited about just continuing to talk and teach about not only the dynamics of privilege and oppression and white privilege within the US, but I want to blow it up to this larger context to talk about USer privilege across the globe and talk about those connections with whiteness, white supremacy, and US supremacy and privilege, because I think they're so clearly connected, and it's really important that we give people this kind of broader context understanding. So will you help me do that, Dr. Moore? Oh, I think you're muted, Eddie.
Yes, 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 yes. In fact, we got to get you back on just to talk about that topic, global.
Let's do it. I
white
love it.
supremacy.
I've been dying to talk about that topic.
We're going to do a part 2, but for now, we're going to let you go because I know you got to get going for mama duty.
Yes.
And I just want to say thank you again for all the years of supporting me and my work, as well as the conference. And you're always welcome to come and be a part of what we're doing. But I'm looking forward to us doing a part 2 to talk a little bit more about global white supremacy.
Let's do it. I want to do it. That's the next what do they call it? Like the next pathway or evolution or
That's right.
something.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, take care, Eddie.
All right, much love. Appreciate you. Here's a little virtual.
You too. Virtual hug. Say vertical hug. Okay.
All right, give my best to Glenn, the girls. Appreciate you.
I will.
Bye-bye.
Yes, you too, to your family. Bye.